welcome back to Live and Breathe Horses, and today we're going on with our Words of Wisdom series from Tom Dorrance and his beautiful book, More Than a Horseman. So, welcome to story time, because this book, in case you missed the previous ones, is stories about Tom, a collection of stories from people who knew him, collected by his wife Margaret Dorrance and John St. Ryan. So, today's story is from Bob Barrett. When I first got acquainted with Tom, he and Margaret had moved to Merced. There was a fellow who had a place on the southwest side of Merced, and at the time built horse stall panels, gates, etc. Tom was working on his automatic gate on his place. I was working at Merced College at the time and was teaching a colt class that had an aged colt, about 4 or 5 years old, that had been through a few hands and he was really ouchy. I found out where the Dorrance fellow was working on his gate and set out to see if I could get him to give me a hand with Mr. Horse. By that time, I'd figured, after all that I'd heard about Tom, he had to be at least 10 foot tall. But here was this little bow-legged cowboy working on a gate, and he looked at the gate just like he did a horse. He was hung up a little on it at the time and told me, "It's right here, waiting for me to use it, but I just don't see it yet." Anyhow, he agreed to help the horse with me, and that started our long relationship. The first few days, Tom worked with the horse, right in the horse's pen. When we moved the horse out to a large pen, I was thinking, we're finally getting down to the horse breaking. I backed my pickup up to the pen, had my saddle on the tailgate and was ready. Well, Tom stayed on the outside of the pen and moved the horse around with his flag and got more done than most fellows could get if they were in there with the horse. Tom picked up his rope, got in the pen with the horse, and I'm thinking, finally, going to get to the horse breaking. Well, Tom moved the horse around. The old horse changed direction a time or two. Then the old horse faced up and stopped. Tom threw a big overhand loop over the horse's head, and after the loop settled for a while, he flipped it off and said that was enough for today. I thought about that for a long time, and I still think about it. Tom was working on me as much as the horse. He could read people like he could a horse. Tom's approach was a lot different than what I'd learned, but it was a whole lot better. I will say, maybe the first year I was around Tom, when we went to work on a horse, he always asked me, "How much time do you have?" And I would always say, "Whatever you have," knowing that if I only said a set amount of time, that would have been the end of the deal. Tom and Margaret used to keep their horses out at a fellow's place on the outskirts of town, and Tom was putting in some corner posts for the fence. There was about a foot of good soil and the rest was hard pan. I stopped by about the time Tom was down to the hard pan and he was chiselling away with a rock bar. I took the bar and would chisel for a while. Then Tom would use the clamshell to clean out what little bit I'd chiselled. I stopped by daily until the job was finished. From that point on, Tom never asked me how much time I had. Tom had a lot of neat sayings. One thing that sticks in my mind was, "The things you need to know first in life, you generally learn last." Oh, I love that one. Also, a carbon copy is not as good as the original. Another of Tom's originals was for people who would ask him about the mule, and he would say, "Just like a horse, but more so." One time Tom was visiting a horse ranch and a fellow pulls up and unloads his stud horse. The stud gets a hold of this fellow, and after the fellow gets loose, he begins to beat on the horse. Later in the day, he asked Tom what he would have done, and Tom says, "I don't know. I've never been bit, never been bit." When Tom and Margaret left Merced, they lived in Gustine for a while. Tom was around 80 years old at this time, and he just started a colt. He came riding in one day, and the fellow asked him, "Having trouble with your horse, Tom?" And Tom said, "No, he's having trouble with me." This fellow had a horse he wanted to get started, but he couldn't catch him. Tom and I drove over to the fellow's place. The horse was in a large corral, and the horse was standing on the far side of it. Tom peeked through the board fence, and asked the guy if he had any alfalfa hay. And when the man went to get it, Tom reached down and pulled up a handful of green grass and stuck his hand through the fence and began to flex his wrist. When the fellow came back, the horse was eating grass from Tom's hand. I knew Tom in his early years was a good friend to Cliff Wade. I asked Tom about Cliff, and Tom said, "Looked like he got along with the horse okay." When the Wade saddle began to get popular, people that were starting to use them would give you their opinion on how good or not so good they thought they were. So I thought I would ask Tom and really find out the truth about them. All Tom said was, "One time I thought I ought to have one." I asked Tom about his early relationship with Ray. Tom said Ray was his best guinea pig he ever had. He was itching, and I got him to scratch. I asked Tom, Tom wasn't one for fame or publicity. His whole deal was the horse and the horse's well-being. And he was real careful when somebody wanted to write an article about him. This young fellow I knew wanted to do a story on Tom for a known horse magazine, and so I asked Tom and he agreed to talk to the man. The guy shows up at Tom's house and they visit for a while, and the guy wants to get started with the interview, and Tom says, "Have you read my book?" And the fellow says, "Yes." And the first question he asked Tom was, "Where were you born?" Tom never says a word, just gets up, walks over and hands the guy his book. That was Tom. The red-faced young man got to do the article. You couldn't get Tom in an argument. He would shut down when he had to and firm up as well. His whole deal was to get along in life, and he applied that to the horse as well. He always said when working with the horse and things really came apart and your life was at stake, do whatever it takes, and that might not be enough. Tom is talking about his growing up on the family ranch where his folks raised cattle, both registered and commercial, where he and his dad and his brothers broke a lot of work horses to the saddle. Said it made a big difference when they were starting in the harness. Tom said being small, he knew that he couldn't out-stout the big draft horses, so he had to think more about the horse's side of things in order to get along. He made a blindfold set up on his bridle that would slip it down to cover the horse's eyes, and that made it easier to get on. When it was time to get off, he just lowered the blinds. Riding out through the hills, after the horse had settled down, Tom carried a long rope with a gunny sack attached to it that he would drag behind the horse, and he would gradually work this towards the horse until he could place it anywhere and the horse would accept it. I asked Tom if he ever did any braiding, and he said that he'd made his own riatas up until the family ranch was sold in 1965. Tom went to Nevada and went to work for Tom Marvel. It was branding time and they gave him a new nylon rope. At the end of the first week, he wore the ondo out and tied a new one on the other end, and he never used a riata again. Tom had quite the way of looking at things. You know how sometimes you'll trip and you run along to try to catch yourself so you won't hit the ground. Tom was getting along in his years then, and he told me that one of the things he was getting a lot faster at was when that happened to him, he said, "I just go straight to the ground." Tom was Tom, but he was always consistent. My thanks to Tom for teaching me a better way to communicate with the horse. It certainly helped me in my job and life. Behind every good man is a good woman, and Margaret deserves a lot of credit for her handwork in the daily chores and supporting Tom. So, that's our story for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to see you next time.